So this is our question and answer segment for week 5. So some good questions as usual. So let's kick it off. Based on later Reconstruction snippet, how exactly did free slaves manage to get elected to Congress, even though the African Americans were permitted to vote via the 15th Amendment? Was the population strong enough to support these Black candidates? And how did African Americans essentially outnumber white former slaveholders or racists? This is a very good question. And basically, if you look at the performance of Black legislators in the South, they disproportionately came from a handful of states: South Carolina, Mississippi, to a lesser extent, Alabama, North Carolina, Florida. These were states that had a significant plurality of the population was Black, or in the case of South Carolina and Mississippi, a majority of the population was Black after 1870. So, for instance, this is Joseph Rainey, Republican congressman from South Carolina. He's the first African American elected to the House of Representatives. His district was primarily rural district here in eastern South Carolina. Majority African American district. You can see he wins relatively comfortably. So in the 1870s, as long as there was this federal military presence, or at least some political support for free Blacks in the South, African Americans were able to do well in congressional districts where they had a majority. There's very little evidence in the 1870s, or frankly for many years thereafter, of white voters in any significant number in the South voting for African American candidates. And so the result is we do get a couple of Black senators in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. Because remember, at this point, senators are elected by the state legislature. There are two African American senators, both from Mississippi, in the Reconstruction period, but there are no African Americans who are elected governor. So that's a statewide position in the Reconstruction period. So even in Mississippi and South Carolina, where Blacks are a majority of the electorate, they're unable to elect an African American governor. But in these congressional districts where the population is overwhelmingly African American, at least until the political violence of Jim Crow and the Ku Klux Klan begins to dramatically escalate after the Compromise of 1876. The population disparity between white and Black is enough where you do get Black legislators elected, at least in some of these southern districts. A related question. So why did the people of the North lose interest in the issue? Were they ever that into the issue of discrimination and genuine equality? And just from a tactical standpoint, why is it that the Republicans didn't really press this this issue in terms of preserving the right of African Americans to vote in the South on the grounds that was the only way that the Republicans could win in the South? The second question asked it more directly: why would the Republicans weaken enforcement in the South if it meant they'd never potentially anyway get a shot at winning a state? There again, due to the voter suppression. And there are a couple of reasons for this. The first is that even in the Gilded Age, so in 1896, there's a broader national realignment. The Republicans become the clear national majority. But even in the Gilded Age, the Republicans can win without doing anything in the South. So this is the presidential map of 1888. You can see the so-called solid South, all here in blue. So the South is basically, by this point, become a one-party Democratic region. Republican presidential candidates are no longer competitive in the region, and nonetheless, Benjamin Harrison, a Republican, is elected because he basically sweeps the North, losing only New Jersey and Connecticut. So there is an electoral college majority, if you're just a partisan Republican looking at this from a partisan angle, that allows for a Republican to be elected to the presidency without winning even one Southern vote. And because the House, as was the case before the Civil War, has a non-Southern majority, Republicans can be a majority in the House without having any Southern support. So from a straightforwardly tactical standpoint, Republicans can abandon black voters in the South and still win a majority. And then the other thing here, that there's a transformation within the Republican Party in the 20 or 30 years after the Civil War. So, at the creation of the Republican Party in 1854, it's a curious alliance of some economic conservatives and sort of union nationalists and abolitionist people who in the contemporary U.S. political environment would basically be on the kind of the left wing of the Democratic Party in a lot of respects. The liberal reformist wing of the Republican Party, though, largely dies out in the aftermath of the Civil War, and by the 1880s, it's basically a conservative, pro-business party. So there isn't a lot of ideological push from Republican legislators or from Republican voters for aggressive action to uphold the rights of African Americans in the South. And since they can assemble a winning political coalition without black voters in the South, that means they don't really have a lot of tactical pressure either. Why was the Supreme Court in the Gilded Age so pro-business? Did the other houses of the U.S. government, legislative and executive, reflect the same agenda? And the answer to that is absolutely yes. This is a very famous cartoon from the period from a magazine called Puck, which was a muckraking magazine. And the title is The Bosses of the Senate, and it's framed as if the Senate, so here are the senators, is actually a bar, and these large men who are designed to represent corporations or trusts put their bellies up to the bar. So we see the Steel Beam Trust and the Copper Trust and the Sugar Trust and the Coal Trust. And the idea is that big business is basically buying and selling members of the Senate, which in effect they are. It's a very, very corrupt period in American history. So in this respect, the Supreme Court's position is really no surprise. This is an era where Congress tends to be very favorably inclined towards corporations, where the presidents of both parties tend to be very favorably inclined towards corporations, and the Supreme Court is largely following the guidance of the people who nominate them. One other thing that's significant here is that the federal court system in the 1880s and 1890s becomes much more professionalized, and in this era, you get more technical rules in federal filing, and so corporations tend to have the advantage against, say a single person that's filing a lawsuit against them. So it's an arena that's sort of structurally favorable to corporations as well. Would it be adequate to compare the Chinese Exclusion Act along with other racial injustices to those faced by blacks and Irish immigrants on the East Coast? This is a difficult question. Obviously there's discrimination in each of these areas. The situation with regards to the Chinese, though, I think is different, and this is the text of the Chinese Exclusion Act, which I also showed in one of the snippets. And what's striking about the text is this it contains the absolute exclusion of Chinese immigrants coming to the United States. And it is true, when we get to 1921 and then to 1924, Congress will enact a law that sets quotas in terms of immigration to the United States on the basis of ethnicity. But between 1882 and 1921, it's only Chinese immigrants who have this absolute ban. So the complete ban is a discrimination of a different sort than what was faced by African Americans or Irish immigrants who are coming in the East. So I think the answer to this question is that Chinese are largely sui generis in terms of immigration policy, although the Exclusion Act does set the precedent for broader immigration restriction legislation in the aftermath of World War I. And then the last question is more of a comment, and I think a perceptive one, about how unbelievable and underrated the court system is. Theoretically, the weakest branch of government, but we see all of these instances so far in this course where the court is exercising substantial power, and I think this is absolutely true. I mean, we saw this week with some of these Gilded Age decisions regarding the 14th Amendment, where the court is sort of framing an imaginary sense of the 14th Amendment. So here's an area where to the extent that the framers believed that the courts were really not going to be a particularly significant element of American politics. You could argue that that's maybe the case until the 1850s, but from then on, that just hasn't been the case. And if you think of our current situation, say over the last 10 years or so in American politics, as Congress has become more and more dysfunctional, it's become harder and harder for Congress to pass even basic legislation. That's created a kind of policy vacuum into which the courts have seeped, and so you see more and more of these decisions from the courts that 30 or 40 or 50 years ago likely would have been handled by Congress. So, the court system wouldn't be teaching this course if this weren't the case. The court system is to me sort of critical in terms of understanding American political history and American political culture for most of the last 200 years. So that's it for the snippets for this week. Hope everyone is staying safe, and the reading is being sent along with this email.